Hello, everyone. Please be patient with us shortly.
Good evening, one and all. Very warm welcome. We are waiting for a few more people to join and Professor Sangeeta Menon to join. I think ma'am is here. We will start in a minute.
A warm welcome, everyone. We apologize for the slight delay in starting today's session. We welcome you all for a very exciting lecture by Professor David Shulman, who is present with us today. And I'll kindly request Professor Sangeeta Menon, the Head and Dean, NIAS Consciousness Studies Program, School of Humanities, to please introduce today's scholar. Ma'am, over to you.
Namaste, all of you. And thank you so much. It's a great privilege to have Professor David Shulman as the speaker for the series today. And I think it is indeed our fortune that this date and time was convenient for Professor David Shulman. And the series is actually a result of a concept which Professor Madhav Deshpande and I discussed and designed. And then it is again our sheer fortune that Madhuji and I could get David Shulman and a few others who are going to really make a big difference to this series by their scholarship and by their wisdom and insights. I don't think Professor David Shulman is a person who needs great introduction. And many of us have known his work. And I also remember listening to him in IAAC some time back. So Professor Shulman also is a frequent traveler, not only to India, but also to Kerala, my own state. And it's once again, a great privilege, sir, to have you here. And we thank you from our bottom of our heart. And we very much look forward to your lecture. And I request Preet Kona, who is putting together today's program, to tell us what is the next episode of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. First of all, namaskaram, sir, and a very warm welcome to one and all. I'm extending my warm invitation to you and all the participants who are here today. And continuing the tradition, we'll begin today's session with an invocation. And because it is the talk revolves around Maṇipravāḷam also, so today's invocation is going to be in Maṇipravāḷam. I would request Meera Menon, top scholar at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, also student of Professor Sangeeta Menon. I'm unmuting you, Meera.
Yeah.
To start today's session with the invocation. Over to you, Meera.
Thank you, Preet. So, just give me a minute. Good afternoon, everybody. So today I'll be singing a few lines from a Swati Tirunal Padam, which perfectly represents the bhava of his style. Padams are usually slow-moving songs which have a depth of musical intricacies. It's often used as accompaniment for the Mohiniyattam dance, full of lasya. This padam is in Maṇipravāḷam, a beautiful mix of Malayalam and Sanskrit. So Swati Tirunal Ramavarma was the Maharaja of the Kingdom of Travancore in the late 19th century. He is also considered as a brilliant composer and is credited with over 400 classical compositions in both Carnatic and Hindustani style. So in this padam, flavored by bhakti, a forlorn lover of Krishna is awaiting him. She says to her friend that for several days I have been suffering, O moon-faced, remember all my troubles. I thought that Krishna, son of Vasudeva, who is worshipped by Indra and other devas, would come to me and be mine. So there are a few lines from the padam. Kandanodu chinnumille kilimuri shujamiha vada Kandanodu chinnumille kilimuri shujamiha vada Kadarakshi Tandayai Marundin Taruni Mani He Ramaniya Gunavasadi Chalamiri Kandanodu Chinnumille Kilimuri shujamiha vada Paladivasam undehanyan Paladivasam undehanyan Parinata shashadhara mukhi Vasudeva sudan Varuminniha mama tavanai Sakhi Kandanodu chinnumille kilimuri shujamiha vada. Thank you. So Radha is waiting for Krishna. I think since we are on the subject of waiting, we have also been desperately waiting for David sir's lecture. So I think I will not take more time. So very warm welcome to you, sir, and welcome to everybody.
Thank you so much, Meera. That was a beautiful padam in Neelamvari. I think a perfect, it was so much filled with Shringaram, the padam was. And Maharaja Swati Tirunal, definitely in Carnatic music, I think was the foremost who used Maṇipravāḷam. Thank you so much for the beautiful padam, Meera. Before we take this forward, I would request Sangeeta ma'am to speak a few words before we get into the lecture. Ma'am, over to you.
Yeah, it's just less than a minute. I just wanted to once again just convey to Professor David Shulman how excited we are, so keen to listen to you. And I never knew that my excitement is going to be added by the presence of my old-time friend, Professor Dilip Menon, whom I just noticed sitting there. So I also wanted to thank Dilip for being here. And it is so wonderful to see you. And it's such a great opportunity to be all together with all of you. Thank you. And over to you, Professor David Shulman.
Thank you very much. Namaskaram. I hope everybody can hear me. Is that the case? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to say I'm very delighted to be here. It's wonderful to be speaking under the auspices of NIAS, and in this particular series, of course. It's a great honor. Even better would be if I could actually be present physically at NIAS in that space. I hope that that will happen one of these days. However, there is one advantage to the Zoom mode, which is that people from all over the world can join. And that's a lovely thing. And it's very nice to see some friendly, familiar faces. Dilip, nice to see you. Elena, Suganya, there's quite a few. I have a request, if I may, at the very beginning. Most of the attendees are little black boxes with names. I wonder if you could turn on your videos. Yeah, it makes it so much better to have some sense of a living human being and not just a black box. Yeah, thanks a lot. That means a lot to me. In just a moment, we'll put up the shared screen. I'll say a few introductory words, okay? Thank you, by the way, to Sangeeta and to Preet and to everybody, to Mother Deshpande, everybody who had a role in inviting me for this lecture. I'm going to make two or three general comments and then we'll launch right into the subject because it's a big topic. We won't be able to do more than really just scrape the surface, I think. I've divided the lecture into 3 questions which will structure it. Out of these 3 questions, there are 2 which I think I may be able to answer. The third, very likely, you'll have to solve between or among yourselves, unless it turns out that there's more time than I think there's going to be. I'll show you the questions in just a moment. I have a preliminary comment. So we're talking about Sanskrit in the South. First of all, I have to say, most of you probably know, Sanskrit is everywhere in the Southern literary languages, all 4 of them. And there's also a vast literature that was composed in Sanskrit in the South over the centuries. Just to give you some idea of what I mean by that, I have a friend in Hyderabad, Dr. Jitendra Babu, who recently tried to compose a list of works in Sanskrit that were composed in Telangana, not Telangana state, Telangana the region, over the last 300 years or so, mostly in the zamindari courts, and without any difficulty at all, he came to hundreds of compositions, Shastra, Kavya, everything. And that's just in one relatively well-defined small region. If we think about Kerala, I think everybody knows Kerala Sanskrit literature is one of the great literatures of India. There's, I believe, more literary production and Shastra production in Sanskrit from Kerala than in Malayalam. And it's like that throughout the South. That is, we are talking about a truly vast literature that was composed over the centuries in Sanskrit. But it's really not enough to say that because we should be interested in the motivation. Why did people compose books in Sanskrit? And why does Sanskrit have the role that it does? It's an enormous role, even within the vernacular literatures of the South, the 4 major vernacular literatures in Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam. I want to ask you before we begin to put aside any notion that you might have, because it's a prevalent notion, that the relations between Sanskrit and the Dravidian languages, the vernaculars, were in some sense agonistic or antagonistic, that these languages were somehow at odds with one another. That's a very prevalent notion, and it's a false notion. It'd be much better to think of the relations of Sanskrit and the vernaculars as being a kind of symbiosis or a syn energy. You could call it an intimate relationship. Like in all intimate relationships, that means that there are also moments of tension and struggle and competition and so on. But nonetheless, the intimacy and the sin energy is certainly there. Even worse is to think that there was once some kind of primordial, pristine Dravidian language that preceded Sanskrit. And if you follow the kind of political mythology that is still very dominant in some areas, especially in the Tamil country, but not only there, if you follow that, then there's this notion that there was this primeval Dravidian that was somehow infiltrated by Sanskrit or even contaminated by Sanskrit, and that Sanskrit, as it infiltrated these languages, brought with it the whole package of privilege and socio-political things and normative ideologies and all of that. That's a false idea, and it's best just to leave it alone. You have to try to think about Sanskrit in the southern languages in a more complex and interesting way. In any case, we have no primeval Dravidian. There is no attestation of such a thing. Maybe once there was in Neolithic times some kind of Dravidian speech. We don't know where the Dravidian speakers came from. But the earliest evidence that we have in all of the languages in the south, including tribal languages, by the way, but certainly in Tamil and Telugu and Kannada, Malayalam, the earliest evidence we have is of languages in which Sanskrit has already an integral and necessary place. There is, I'll put it very simply, there is no such thing as Tamil without Sanskrit, or Telugu without Sanskrit. There is no such thing. Just as there is no English without the French and Latin component. Even though the case today, very often one finds that the speakers of Dravidian languages, especially Tamil, they may utter sentences that are filled with Sanskrit words. There's more Sanskrit in colloquial Tamil than there is in Hindi. They may utter sentences that are filled with Sanskrit words, but they won't recognize them as Sanskrit at all. It's and I can tell you this on the basis of personal experimentation. And if I say to somebody who's just given a sentence, spoken a sentence that has maybe 30% of Sanskrit lexemes in it, I tell them that these words are Sanskrit, they'll deny it usually because they don't see them as Sanskrit. And there have been some very interesting statistical experiments along these lines that I won't go into now. One last thing I want to say. That is, by way of introduction, and that is that, how shall I say this? We now know, I think we can say that we know with relative certainty that the original substratum, linguistic substratum, that the speakers of Vedic Sanskrit encountered when they came into the subcontinent, whenever that was not Dravidian. Anybody who thinks that all of South Asia was initially speaking Dravidian languages and the Sanskrit-speaking people came in and pushed them more and more into the south, that's again an absolutely false mythological notion. The substratum was not Dravidian. We don't know for sure what was, but the most likely candidate are the Austro-Asiatic languages, that is the Munda, Santali languages, which are still there in India. There's been some very interesting work along these lines. There are something like 300, 350 loanwords from Munda in Vedic Sanskrit, which is really a huge number. And some of those Munda words also went into Dravidian, so that you can see that the sort of line of transmission was Austro-Asiatic, sometimes into Dravidian, and very often into Vedic Sanskrit. Okay. Preet, if you could put up the share screen now, this is the time to do that. Great. Okay. I hope everybody can see this. You can see it? Can everybody see the shared screen? Yeah, great. Okay. So here are the three questions. Number one, why did people write in Sanskrit? And by that I mean whether it's a single verse or a single phrase or a set of several verses or a complete text that is composed in Sanskrit. Why write in Sanskrit? It's a really important question. again, I want to say, somebody who chooses to write in Sanskrit, he does so or she does so because there's some motivating idea, and we'll explore that immediately. One possible answer to this question, which I'm going to set aside at the beginning, is that people wrote in Sanskrit because of its inherent cultural prestige or its hierarchical value. I want you to forget about that readily available idea. We'll see if we can say something a little more interesting and nuanced about the choice. Okay. So why compose in Sanskrit? Secondly, what kind of Sanskrit is it? Vernacular, or whether it's a Sanskrit kavya or shastra, which is composed by somebody whose mother tongue was some Dravidian language but is writing in Sanskrit. What kind of Sanskrit is it? And thirdly, this is the question, I'm not sure we'll reach this point, but I'm going to leave it here for you to see it. What do we mean in the South Indian context when we use a word such as Sanskrit? The answer to that question is not self-evident. If there's time, I'll say a few words at least towards the end of the talk, okay? So we're going to start with the first question. Why compose in Sanskrit? And I just said to you a moment ago that from the very earliest sources that we have in Tamil, we see rather a lot of Sanskrit, not only words, there's more than that, more than just words. So here's an example from Sangam Poetry. Here's a poem probably composed around the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Most of you will know that there was a great literature of love poetry and war poetry in ancient Tamil. We call it Sangam Poetry. It was recovered in the middle of the 19th century by Uve Saminath Iyer. He was the founder of my Guru Parampara. And this is now, for the Tamilians, this is their great literary treasure. That is this collection of thousands of poems in Old Tamil. So here's a love poem from the Kurundugai collection. I'm going to read it to you first in English. You see the poet's name, Milai Perungandan. I'm going to read it to you in the translation of A.K. Ramanujan, for the simple reason that poems that Ramanujan translated cannot be improved upon in English. Even though there are things in Raman's translation that I might have done a little differently myself, but it doesn't matter. Let's read the poem in English. Love, and he said, by the way, this is a poem which is spoken by the Talaivan, that is to say the male hero, the male lover. And he's talking to a friend of his, a male friend of his, and he's in love. He's in love with a young woman. Love, love, they say. Yet love is no new grief, nor sudden disease, nor something that rages and cools. Like madness in an elephant coming up when he eats certain leaves, love waits for you to find someone to look at. Okay, you can take a moment to digest this rather lovely poem. Kind of introspective philosophical poem about what love is. I'm going to read it to you in Tamil, and you'll see why in just a moment. Kamam, kaman yemba, kamam, anangum piniyum andre, nunangi kaduttalum tanidalum indre, yaneve kulahum indran madampola, paniyum udaitade kanunar perine. So you can see, you're having trouble seeing this on the screen. I see there's a problem in the chat. People are able to see the text on the screen, mostly? Yeah, okay. So you can see why I chose this poem. This poem has one Sanskrit word in it, repeated 3 times though, so it's rather emphatic. Kama. Kama. Kaman. Kamam. Yenba. Kama. Love, love, they say. So here's the question. Why does this poet, who's composing in Tamil, why does he use this word? The You didn't have to use that word. There are plenty of words for kama, desire, and love in Tamil, Dravidian words. There are also Dravidian words other Dravidian words that come from Sanskrit, like asai, very common word for desire and for love. Asai comes from Sanskrit, asha. But he's chosen the word common. So why has he done that? What's the point? Why insert a Sanskrit term? And I'm just going to suggest certain possibilities, but I think it should be clear to all of you that common here has a certain resonance in the text. Here's a poem about desire and love. And the poet has taken a word that comes with it, brings with it, a certain wide range of associations, because by the time this poet was writing, let's say it's the 2nd or 3rd century AD, kama was also, let us call it a learned or scientific domain in Sanskrit. I don't know whether the Tamil poet had actually read the Kama Sutra or heard the Kama Sutra. I don't know. It's possible. But he may very likely have known that there was such a thing as Kama Shastra. Kama, the domain of erotics. Or maybe he would have read some of the poems or known some of the poems from the Saptasai in Prakrit, which is filled with the world of the Kama Sutra. So to use a word like kama here is not an entirely innocent usage. It also calls attention to itself. Look at it 3 times in the space of the initial line. It calls attention. It stands out. It's a Sanskrit word, and it stands out because it's a Sanskrit word which comes with that intertextual resonance. So here's one reason that a person might compose in Sanskrit. We'll come back to it. That intertextual reference, the fact that there's a wide range of potential association, that comes along with the choice of the word kama. You could also say that this Sanskrit word has a kind of specific gravity. It has weight, cultural weight. And aside from that, there's the phonoaesthetic element. I'll come back to that. And there's something about clarity, and we'll see that in just a moment. We'll come back to these in just a second. These are certain advantages that Sanskrit might possibly have. There's one last thing. So I said this is a usage that calls attention to itself. But by doing so, by calling attention to kama, it's almost as if the Tamil poet was positioning himself at a certain angle to that world of Kama Shastra, Kama Sutra, the Saptasai. It's almost, look at how the poem goes. People talk about Kama, they say this and that, everybody seems to mean something by it. But what do they know? I know what love is. It's as if he were saying, what do they know about Kama? I will tell you about kama. You see that it sets up a kind of complexity. There's a nuanced complexity that is built into the mere selection of this word kama. Okay? Okay? Okay, let's go on. We'll take another example. We're going to skip 500 years. I have 2 metapoetic examples from Telugu. So we'll start with a verse. It's a well-known verse from NIAS Mahabharatamu. This is the first part of the translation or adaptation into Telugu of the Mahabharata. We have 3 Mahabharata poets in Telugu. Translating the Mahabharata directly from start to finish is considered to be a very dangerous thing. Best not to attempt it. And indeed, in the Telugu case, we have 3 translators. 2 of them died before they could finish. The first of them was Nannaya. Nannaya created Telugu poetry as we know it. He produced the paradigm. And for those of you who read Telugu and know Telugu, you know that the Telugu style of Nannaya is particularly ravishing. It's a very beautiful style, and it's of course filled with Sanskrit, like nearly all Telugu poetry. Nannaya, very much towards the beginning of his Mahabharatamu, he gives a metapoetic verse in which he explains his poetic practice or theory. Let's read the verse. I'll read it first in Telugu. Saramatin Kavindrulu, Prasanna Kata Kalitalta Yuktilon, Arasi Melunani Tarul, Akshararamyatanadarim Banana Ruchiarta Suktinidhi, Nannaya Bhattu Tenungunan, Mahabharata Samhita Rachana Bandhurudayen Jagadhyambuga. Or in English, Nannaya, he speaks about himself in the third person. Nannaya became absorbed in composing in Tenungu. Tenungu is the old way of saying Telugu. Nannaya became absorbed in composing in Tenungu the whole Mahabharata collection. His carefully uttered words glow with multiple meanings. Poets with penetrating minds follow the lively narrative through to its inner purpose, while others give themselves to the harmony of the sounds. And I've highlighted in bold the Sanskrit chunks that appear in this verse as part of this statement of Nannaya's poetic cri de coeur, how he explains what he's doing. So here again that question, why has Nannaya given these phrases in Sanskrit instead of in Telugu? It's not because he couldn't say it in Telugu. We have a Telugu poet not long after Nannaya's period, probably a little after Nannaya's period, Naiṣadhīya, also gives us a meta-poetic introduction to his work. It's standard in Telugu. Most of it is in Dravidian lexemes. Even though Naiṣadhīya, like everybody else, Naiṣadhīya has a lot of Sanskrit in his poems. Anyway, Nannaya has chosen Sanskrit here. Look what he says. His poems, they have three major features. Prasanna Kata Kalitalta Yukti, which we, that is Velcheru Narayana and myself, translated as following the lively narrative through to its inner purpose, yukti. And he also speaks about akshararamyata, the beauty of the sounds, the phonoaesthetic quality of Sanskrit, the harmony of the sounds. And then nana ruchiarta suktinidhi, his carefully uttered words glow with multiple meanings. All of it Sanskrit, readily intelligible Sanskrit. There's another thing one might pay attention to. If you look at the shift from line 2 to line 3, you can see that classical Telugu from Nannaya on, he's the first poet, it uses complex enjambment. That is, you can break a word at the end of a line, where normally in Sanskrit there would be a yati break, a strong break, a strong hiatus. But Telugu poetry is set up in such a way that there is always, I want to say again, always, a disjunction between the syntactic flow of the words and the metrical units in which these words are couched. That disjunction is part of the inherent charm of Telugu poetry, of its musicality, and it's already there in Nannaya. So it's a kind of atypical use of Sanskrit on those grounds alone. But again, I want to say, why has Nannaya chosen to give these words in Sanskrit? Prasanna kata kalita utta yukti. Nana ruchiyauta suktinidhi. Akshararamyata. And also the final pada is almost entirely in Sanskrit. So one possible explanation, there's a lot of things that one could say, and you will have your own theories about it, no doubt. But one possible explanation is that he chose these words because of their transparent clarity and precision. That's an aspect of Sanskrit. Sanskrit, when people in the South were writing poetry or writing Shastra, they had the advantage of using, if they wanted to, a readily available, highly precise and elaborated vocabulary in Sanskrit. And that's an advantage of sorts. Whole realms of discourse were so beautifully elaborated and articulated in Sanskrit that in some ways it was hard to use any other language. Let me tell you a story. I live in Israel. So in Israel we speak modern Hebrew. That's a language which was once a kind of Sanskrit. That it was a learned language. People used to write in it, and maybe learned people would converse in it. But it was not a living language, a mother tongue, until it was revived at the end of the 19th century, mostly through the work of a single great linguist whose name was Eliezer ben Yehuda. Believe me, it was a huge effort, a huge cultural effort. Sometimes I think it's the only really good thing that came out of the state of Israel, or the whole Zionist project. The only positive thing, maybe, is the fact that modern Hebrew was revived into this absolutely fantastic language that we speak today as the mother tongue of my children and the language that I teach in and write poetry in and so on. But there was a moment, listen to this, there was a moment, you'll excuse the diversion, there was a moment in the year 1913 when there was what is called in Hebrew Milchemet Alashon, the language war. And that's because a group of people in Germany wanted to set up a technical institute of higher education in India. In Israel. And they came up with the money for that. But then there was the question of what language would be used to teach technical subjects like physics and chemistry and mechanics and all those kinds of things. And the initial presumption was that there is only one language in which you can even do that at all, namely German. German has the readily available vocabulary for these kinds of things. Modern Hebrew was still inventing new words all the time on the basis of the ancient words. It didn't have words for all kinds of domains, like these domains, But the teachers in all of the Hebrew-speaking schools in the country, and Hebrew was still a very young language, modern Hebrew, they went on strike because they insisted that this technical institute teach only in modern Hebrew, and they won. The strike was successful, and as a result, people began teaching these topics in Hebrew. But I want you to see the idea behind this. The idea was there was German, which had this tremendous, readily available, very precise technical vocabulary, and so there was a great temptation to use that vocabulary. Okay? So you could say something like that about the availability of Sanskrit, the clarity and the precision, and the richness of it. There's another thing here. It's not perhaps so transparent from the verse that I've brought you, but it's true in a general way about especially Shastric work in Sanskrit that was composed in the South, or for that matter anywhere in India. There's the principle that I call the Gary Tubb principle, because he first articulated it, at least as far as I'm concerned. Gary Tubbs, one of the world's great Sanskritists, he said, if you're reading Sanskrit Shastra, then once you've finally figured out what they're trying to say, you are astonished by the elegance and economy with which they've said it. That's the Gary Tubb principle, and those of you who read Shastra in Sanskrit know what he means. And that applies to somebody who might choose to write in Sanskrit in some small town in Telangana or anywhere else in the South. Okay? It's also interesting that in this particular verse, he's chosen to use Sanskrit in a metapoetic context. In other words, he's trying to say something about the nature of writing poetry in general, in Telugu, of course. And for that, it could be that Sanskrit has a certain priority. I'll give you another example. Let's go down a few lines. Again, this is a later text. There's a kavya work, Prabandha text by Bhattumurti called the Vasucaritramu. It's a 16th century, mid-16th century text from the period of the great Telugu kavyas. It's my favorite book in Telugu, I can tell you as a secret. So Bhattumurti, too, like other Telugu poets, he's given us a metapoetic statement about his own work, what his poetry, his poetic style is like. It comes in the midst of a sandesha. There's a moment where the heroine of this work, whose name is Girika, has sent a messenger, young woman, with a love message to her absent lover, who is Maharaja Vasu Maharaja. And these two lovers have seen one another, but they've never actually met. And the messenger is supposed to come and deliver this message of the state of agonizing viraha, longing that the heroine is in. So she comes, she flies into the palace, and the first thing that she sees is that people are singing verses. All kinds of people there are apsarasas and charanis and yakshinis and so on. And how are they singing? They're singing, there's a line about the charanis, the charana kanyakal, chatula vagvachitrito, gandharva kantal, suganta ninadari shayambuto. Again, all in Sanskrit, words quivering with wonder and an exuberance of full-throated resonance. But this is a Telugu verse. And yet he's just like Nanaya before him, he's chosen to explain his credo, his aesthetic, poetic credo, in writing Telugu verse in Sanskrit words. Probably for the same kinds of reasons that I've just described. Okay, if you're still with me, let's go and take somewhat more substantial example. So far, I've only shown you little tiny bits of Sanskrit embedded in a Tamil or Telugu verse, right? But now let's look at a mature Telugu Prabandham text, which is absolutely replete with Sanskrit, so heavily full of Sanskrit that there are verses that are entirely in Sanskrit and yet in Telugu at the same time. There's a kind of miracle of transmutation that happens. So I'm not going to be able to explain all of that, but I'll give you some examples of how this works. So I'm taking a couple of verses from the Telugu poet Srinatha. He's a 15th century poet, and he produced a Naiṣadhamu, that is to say a Telugu Prabandha, which is a kind of adaptation or translation, if you want to use that word, of Sri Harsha's Naiṣadhīya Charita, one of the great Sanskrit kavyas. Tells the story of Nala and Damayanti, as most of you will know. So here's a verse. Let's read the Sanskrit verse. Srinatha, I can tell you, he sticks very close to the Sanskrit original, at the same time transforming that original every single time. So here's a verse, a wonderful verse. This is at the moment, at the beginning of the Nala Damayanti story, where Nala and the goose are having their initial conversation, and the goose is trying to explain to Nala that Damayanti is the most beautiful woman in the world. And the goose knows, because he's seen her, and he's also seen everybody else in the world, all other beautiful women. So look how he says it. This is in Sri Harsha's Sanskrit description. It's a wonderful verse. He says, Sarasi parishilitum maya gamikaumi kritanaika nivrita atititvamanai sadrishoho sadasatsam shayago charodari. Most Sri Harsha verses take a moment, at least a moment, to be understood even by somebody who knows Sanskrit well. You know what? Let's take a moment. I'll give you 30 seconds to figure out the verse. Those of you who know Sanskrit well. Many of you will know the verse. Okay, that's 30 seconds. Now let's read an English translation. The goose is speaking, right? The goose is speaking. A connoisseur of lakes and pools, I lay claim to the verb to go, having made going my vocation, peripatetically progressing from land to land. It's an attempt to render the arcane quality of the Sanskrit. That is how I entertained her in my vision for a moment, though I can't be certain I saw her waist, which may, or then again may not, be there. Because as all of you know, all beautiful women in India, which is to say all women in India, they are supposed to have a waist so thin that it may not even be visible to the naked eye. So look how Sri Harsha has said it. There are two things here. The part about the waist is the easy part. Sad asat sanshaya gocharodari. She has a waist which is sadasat sanshaya, amenable to doubt. Does it or does it not exist? Okay, that part, we'll see how it turns into Telugu in just a second. The most amazing part of this verse, however, typical for Sri Harsha, is this phrase, Gami kaumi kritanaika nivrita maya anai sadrishohi. He says, literally, Gami kaumi krita naika nivrita. I have turned the verb to go, gami, I have turned it into an active profession or vocation, kaumi krita. He's also used a very unusual word for desha, country, a region, nivrit. So he says the goose, I'm a person who has many regions, more than one, naika, which have been made amenable to the act of going places. In other words, I've been everywhere and I've seen everyone. And so I can tell you for sure that Damayanti is the most beautiful woman in the world, okay? You know, all Sri Harsha verses are amenable to spending a lot of time and trying to figure out what really is happening here. We could speak for the next hour just about this verse. Instead of that, let's see how Srinatha has turned this verse into Telugu. So he's written a slightly longer verse. I'll read it first in Telugu. Kamalendi vidushandamanditala satkasara sevaratin gami kaumi krita naika nivritudanai kantin vidau bambunan ramanim palavapanim padmanayanan rakendu bimbananan samapinastani nasti nasti vichikitsa hetushato darin. Those of you who know Sanskrit but don't know Telugu would have no problem understanding this verse, even if you had not seen the Sri Harsha original. It's all Sanskrit, except for one word, kantin. I saw, I've seen, kantin. All the rest of it is Sanskrit, and yet, again, I want to say this is a Telugu verse, no mistaking about it. It's not a Sanskrit verse. It's a Telugu verse. Okay, what did he do? You can imagine the challenge. He had to do something with that phrase, gami kaumi krita naika nivrita maya, right? So what did he do? There's a story about this. They say that Srinatha, a great poet, when he finished his Naiṣadhamu, like all poets in Telugu, he is supposed to have had doubts about the worthiness of his new creation. And he wanted to get the approval of a truly great Telugu poet. And so he found someone. That's somebody who was called Pillamarri Virabhadrakavi. He's a well-known Telugu poet, but actually, according to the story, he was a 10-year-old boy and he was playing ball with his friends in a street. But Srinatha went to him and said to him, you know, I've just produced the Telugu version of DEAN Shuldman, and I'd like to see if you like it. So the little boy, this 10-year-old boy, said to him, well, how did you translate that phrase? That is to say, Gami kaumi krita naika nivrita. How did you do that in Telugu? And Srinatha said, well, it was easy. I said, Gami kaumi krita naika nivritudanai. He added a small 2 or 3 syllables Telugu first person suffix to the Sanskrit calc, the Sanskrit expression. Simply took it over. So they say that the young poet Virabhadrakavi said, if that's the way you did it, then give us back our Telugu endings, nu, do, give them back to us, and give your Naiṣadhamu to the Sanskrit pundits, he said. And you can see that this is a story which relates to the fact that you can do something like that you can embed a sequence of arcane and challenging Sanskrit in a Telugu verse, and that's perfectly okay. But it also stands out and once again calls attention to itself. Except that once you do that, once you make a citation of that sort, a quotation, you've also changed something in the original. You've produced something that has a resonance and a depth and maybe all kinds of other things, like a little slight jarring sense of dissonance or disjunction. And what about the waste that may or may not be there? Look what Srinatha has done. It's in the final phrase of this verse, so therefore very highlighted. It's nasti, nasti, vichikitsa, hetusha, todrin. Very beautiful phrase. It means the same thing as the Sri Harsha phrase. It's a little longer. He's expanded and amplified it. One reason that one might want to use Sanskrit in a verse like this in a vernacular verse is because it allows for playful intensification or amplification. As we find here, Asti nasti vichikitsa hetusha todarin. He has intensified what was already a rather pregnant, intense, and original idea, and produced a kind of particular beauty. Okay? Let's take another example. Let's go down. Still from the Naiṣadhamu. Okay. You can see I have a note there about this Telugu verse. Oh, sorry, I didn't read you the English translation of the Telugu. Let's do that now before we go on. So you remember the Sri Harsha verse, right? Here's the Srinatha verse. Since I delight in pools adorned with lotuses and lilies, I lay claim to the verb to go, having made going my vocation, peripatetically progressing from land to land. We tried to maintain that citation, because that was there in our English version of the Sri Harsha text, right? Just like in Srinatha. That's how I saw her in Vidarbha, a ravishing woman, her hands like creepers, eyes like lotuses, her face the moon in all its fullness, with two equally full breasts, and a waist so tiny you might wonder if it is or isn't truly there. I call this re-Sanskritization. He's taken a Sanskrit phrase and translated it back into Sanskrit, which is a kind of Telugu. He's re-Sanskritized it, thereby surpassing the original, among other things. Okay? That's the echo chamber of Sanskrit quotation in Telugu. Okay, let's take another verse. This is a beautiful verse. I'll explain the context just very, very briefly. So you'll remember that Nala, when he's on his way to Damayanti's Swayamvara, he's stopped on the way by the four Dikpalas, Indra and the other three, because they also want to marry Damayanti, and they send Nala, poor fellow, as a messenger to Damayanti in order to give her that message and to try to persuade her to marry one of them, right? You all remember that, I hope. And Nala has no chance, so he goes on this mission, and he manages to get into the palace, the Antapura, the women's quarters in the palace of Bhima in Vidarbha. He's invisible. He has a Tiraskarini Shakti. He's invisible by the grace of Indra. And he wanders, and there's a fantastic chapter in the Naiṣadhīya, chapter 6, where you see Nala wandering among all these women. There are lots and lots of women in the Antapura, but they can't see him. He's invisible. On the other hand, his image appears in the mirrors on every shiny space, and there are also footprints in the sand, and so on. It's an amazing tour de force. Eventually he comes to Damayanti, and he gives the message. But this first meeting of Nala and Damayanti, which goes on for several cantos in the Naiṣadhīya Charita, this meeting it moves in the direction of a kind of very complex kind of teasing play between the two parties, because Nala, of course, is now seeing Damayanti, but she recognizes him. Little by little, she realizes that this person has to be Nala. And then she wants him to say that. She'll do anything to make him just say his name, to say to her, yes, I'm Nala, because she's already decided that she doesn't want to marry Indra or Varuna or Agni or Yama. She's going to marry this man. But she has to be sure, or she needs to hear the name. And she uses all kinds of tricks to make him say his name, and Nala does everything he possibly can in order to avoid saying his name. Doesn't want to have to own up to it. Since you know the story, I can tell you that in the end, she uses the ultimate weapon, the doomsday weapon, that women have in Sanskrit kavya, namely she breaks into tears and Nala can't stand it, and so he says, can't you see that it's me, Nala, who I'm in love with you, and all of that, But before that happens, there's this verse. She's been begging him to tell him his name, his father's name, his gotra name, his city, all of those things, and he's refusing. And finally he says, Vrita kateya maiva ona paddatihi Kayanu purvya samaketi ketiva Kshame samaksha vyavaharam avayoho pade vidhatum karo yushmadasmadi. My name, does it matter what sounds have been thrown together and in what order by sheer convention? For the present business, now that we are face to face, 2 syllables should suffice. Let's just say, you and me. I hope you'll agree with me, it's a beautiful verse. And by the way, though we don't have time to go into it, by the way, just let me say that this verse also says something about language in general. Because it's true, isn't it, that the name doesn't matter, and even the pronouns may not matter that much in the situation that Nala and Damayanti find themselves. So you can, I hope, agree with me that this too is a challenge to somebody who wants to produce a Telugu version of this verse. And how has he done it? I'll read the Telugu and then this time I'll remember to read the translation. Do you want to move it down a little bit? Preeti? Preet, can you move it down? Okay, fine. Oops. Okay, good. So here's how Nala speaks in Telugu, this same verse. He says, Kuvalaya netra samaksha vyavaharam vunaku yushmad asmat padamul shravana shravana yogyamul chundaga peruchepa narugagamyela. For a conversation face to face, the 2 words you and I are more than adequate and pleasing to the ear. Why ask for a name? You can see once again he's taken the words out of the Sri Harsha text, the Vyavahara, and more important, Yushmat Asmat Padamul, the end of the second line. To appreciate a Srinatha verse in the Naiṣadhamu, it's not always true, but in the Naiṣadhamu for sure, actually it helps to know the Sanskrit original because you get that rich interplay and resonance and the kind of competition, you could say, between the 2 poets and the various other things that come up naturally. Here you'll notice that the placement of that phrase has shifted to the middle of the verse and not to the end. In the Sanskrit verse, Yushman Asmadi in the dual is at the end of the verse. Here it's in the middle of the verse. At the end, you get something else. Why ask for a name? And you know, one of the effects of having shifted it like that is that it produces a kind of colloquial effect. It's almost as if he were actually singing a verse in colloquial Telugu. That's interesting because he has this beautiful but at first perhaps slightly puzzling Sanskrit phrase there in the middle of it. And that kind of interplay has a richness and an aesthetic impact which is a direct result of the fact that he has the Sanskrit chunk embedded in his Telugu verse. So on the one hand, he's simplified the verse. It's much easier to read in the Telugu, if you know Telugu. He's reconfigured the syntax. He's shifted the emphasis, but he's produced a kind of charm, which depends on the fact that that intertext is present, necessarily present. Okay, I hope you see the point. I think this may be all I have to say at the moment about the choice of writing in Sanskrit or composing in Sanskrit, although we'll come back to it at the end. And I know I don't have that much more time. I have another maybe 15 minutes or so, is that right? Yeah, okay, good. Please let's go down to the next thing. Okay, now, so I'm going to the second question. I've been speaking until now about what might motivate the choice of Sanskrit as an expressive medium. But if you remember the second question, which is, what kind of Sanskrit is it? So here we reach a truly remarkable field of research, or just of reading for pleasure. Actually, I have to tell you, this part of my talk is the part which I think is most interesting myself. although I'll only be able to give you a kind of taste, a relatively quick taste of why it's so interesting. We're going to be looking at a Sanskrit text that was composed entirely in Sanskrit by a poet called Śākalyamalla, who's a Telangana poet. He came from a place called Rachakonda. In the early 14th century, there was a king who patronized him, Singamanayalu I. There's something to be said about the Andhra school of Alankara Shastra. This man was part of that in a certain sense. But in any case, he wrote a text, a wonderful text called Udara Raghava. That's one of the many Raghava texts, like the Anargha Raghava of Murari. There are many like that. And indeed, Murari is a present in this Anargha in this Udara Raghava, which is a Ramayana in Sanskrit. But, you know, it's not the usual kind of Sanskrit that all of us normally read if we stick to the classical canon of Sanskrit kavya. There's something different here, and that has to do with the presence of the Telugu substratum in the Sanskrit. So I'm going to give you just 2 or 3 very simple examples. I have an essay about this, which you're invited to read, but let's look at the examples. Maybe I should say in advance something about this. That is, that the great interest, speaking in terms of style and language, linguistics, the great interest in a text like the Udara Raghava has to do with issues of modality and aspects, among other things. So just to be absolutely sure that everybody here knows what I'm talking about, linguists like to talk about aspect. Aspect is a property of the verbal action. Usually they distinguish in a broad way, I'm simplifying, a broad way between what is called perfective and imperfective action. In other words, if you have an action which happens at a particular point in time and is finished, completed, finite, so that's perfective. If you have an action that goes on over a long period of time or whose results continue, and there are all kinds of other such possibilities, that's imperfective. I think actually, first of all, aspect is a universal linguistic phenomenon, but not all languages have aspect built into the morphological system of the verb. Whereas in Indian languages, that is usually the case. In English, for example, we have aspect, but it's usually lexical aspect. I'll give you an example. There was a famous Afro-American preacher in the South who was famous for his sermons. So somebody once asked him, how come your sermons are so popular? So he said the following thing. He explained his technique. He said, what I do, he says, first I tells them what I'm going to tell them. Then I tells them it. Then I tells them what I done told them. That's aspect. I've done told him. It's lexical aspect. That means I told him and I finished telling him. It's over. Okay? So those of you, everybody who's listening now, all of you who speak any Indian language, you know that the aspect is built into the verbal system. So I can say in Telugu, Nenu ippani chesenu, I did this thing, I did this job. That's one way of saying it. But if I say, Nenu ippani chesenu, that means I did it and I finished it and it's over. And similarly in Hindi and Gujarati and Tamil and all of these languages, we have morphological aspect, okay? Except in Sanskrit, mistakenly, I think, we tend not even to notice the fact that aspect exists in a morphological way. We teach our students, I'm guilty of this too, we teach our students that in classical Sanskrit, the distinctions between different kinds of past action have all merged into a single semantic continuum. So it makes no difference if you say Ramo nama babhuva, or if you say Ramo nama asid, or if you say Rama nama abhavat. Makes no difference. It all means once there was a person called Rama, as if there were no nuance or distinction between these different ways of past tense. And to some extent, actually, that is true. It's not true of the Veda or even of Vedic prose. Professor Cardona has a fantastic essay about Vedic prose and things like aspect and tense in the Aitareya Brahmana and other Brahmana texts. I warmly recommend it. But listen to me, I'm telling you this because once one gets to a kind of Sanskrit like Śākalyamalla, suddenly we see that morphological aspect has re-emerged. And that's because Śākalyamalla spoke a language which had it built into the verbal system. I'll give you an example in a moment. Even more impressive than aspect is what we call modality. Modality exists in Sanskrit. Modality means, in the verbal system, you can have an action which takes all kinds of potential forms. You can say, I'm doing this, I'm going to do this, I might be going to do this, I have to do this, I would have done this if I had only known such, and so on. We can go on. There's a whole long range of these modal forms. All Indian languages are rich in morphological modality. In fact, I think I can say, as somebody who's learned Indian languages from the outside, the great joy of speaking an Indian language is in mastering these modal forms, which are omnipresent. Every sentence practically has some kind of modal form. They exist in Sanskrit. Some of them are well known. The optative and the old Vedic language, there was a subjunctive. We could find modality. There's an imperative. There's all kinds of things that exist in Sanskrit as we know it. But that rich kind of nuanced, complex, elaborate modality that we find in any spoken Indian language, that is not usually even noticed when we read Sanskrit. We unfortunately tend to read Sanskrit as if it were a kind of library language, a kind of ancient Greek or Latin. But the vernacular Sanskrit, if you want to call it that, of somebody like Śākalyamalla, it is completely replete with this same kind of modality. So here's a simple example. We'll just look at this one verse, maybe another one afterwards. Here's a verse, Sumantra, the charioteer, he's brought Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana into the wilderness and left them there, and he's come back to the court of Ayodhya. Dasharatha, he's shattered by the fact that Rama is gone. So first Sumantra, the charioteer, he comes to Kausalya, and she prepares him for his meeting with Dasharatha. And look what she says. In Sanskrit, of course. She says, Rama nama yadikopi abhidatte kutra Rama iti maragati dikshu tvam cha Rama iti yadiyavadisha pratyabhotsyata vachopyabhanishyat. So most of you will know that these forms that I've highlighted, avadishya, pratyabhotsyata, and abhanishyat, they belong to what's called rin in Paninian Sanskrit, that is what we call irrealis, or what do we usually call it today? I'm stuck on the Sanskrit word. Panini calls it kriyatipatti, an extension or elaboration of what the meaning of the action is. This is something which is unreal, or potentially unreal. These rim forms, they exist in Sanskrit, but they're relatively rare, except in a few cases where somebody like Bhatti in the Bhatti Kavya writes a whole chapter of rim forms just to demonstrate the fact that they exist. But in the Sanskrit of Śākalyamalla, they're all over the place. So look at this verse. Well, here's what the verse means. Let's go down a little bit. The verse means, if someone happens to mention Rama's name, this is Kausalya speaking to Sumantra. If someone happens to mention Rama's name, he, Dasharatha, scans the horizon, thinking, where is Rama? And you too, were you to say the word Rama, he would wake up and might even answer. All of you could easily translate that English translation into a modern Indian language, could you not? Because we have these irrealis forms. So if you go up a little bit, I just want to show you what the commentator, Sanskrit commentator on this verse, go up just a little bit, what he does when he comes to these vrain forms, these Irialis forms. There's a commentator called Rampalli Gopinatha, more or less from the time period of the author, Śākalyamalla. So he takes each of the vrain forms, avadishya, he translates it into the present, bhavishichet, if you say. That's good. Sanskrit in the present can definitely serve in a modal form. Then you have pratyabhotyata from bud. The aspiration moves back, right? Pratyabhotyata. So the commentator translates this or glosses this as pratibodham lapsyate, future. He'll wake up. He'll wake up. And then vachopi abhanishyat, prativachanam api vadet. He uses what we now call the optative form, the lean form. He might speak. He would wake up, and he might even answer. But look at how the Sanskrit says this. And even in English, my English, and you too, were you to say the word Rama, he would wake up, and he might even answer. All of this is a conjunctural, kind of conjectural thing. It's not that he's going to do it, he might. But actually the chances are that he won't say anything at all, because he's so depressed. So this is Irialis. And you can see how simply and naturally these forms appear in a verse like this in Śākalyamalla. Let's go down and look at another example. Okay, so this is actually just for the fun of it. I just want to show you the kind of things that you see on every page of the Udara Raghava. We'll just quickly look at this example. This is Kausalya speaking to Rama before he goes off into the forest, before the whole disaster happens. She says to him, Vishindhi rajye vibhavam jananam nishpinti papani nijascharitrahi simhasanaste tvaisha satiha mahitalam shitalayami netre. Make a special glory for all the subjects in your kingdom. Grind to dust all evil things by your good deeds. With you enthroned and ruling the earth, I will look on the world with delight. Śākalyamalla netre, I'm going to cool off my eyes. It's obviously some vernacular idiom. Many of you will know it from the languages that you speak. It's infiltrated the Sanskrit. But I wanted you to see Vishindhi Rajhe, Nishpindhi Papani. Those are imperative forms, vishish and nishpish, the verbs. I would guess that most of you, at least, if you're like me, would take a moment to even recognize what the Sanskrit root is. And that's because our author, Śākalyamalla, he loves to give you these arcane forms and tease your mind. And the other interesting thing about that is that he juxtaposes these slightly weird forms with very simple colloquial kind of language. That juxtaposition gives you a particular aesthetic effect, a kind of beauty. Okay, let's look at an aspectual verse. Let's go down one more. This is a description of the wilderness. Rama, Lakshmana, and Sita are in the wilderness. I'll read the Sanskrit first. Paluka eko bahudha jihikke runtadpil enam shunakaira bubukke vanishwa kolahara dirna dikke valmika lina hi panibhi pakke. This is Sanskrit, believe it or not. It doesn't really look very much like Sanskrit. We have our perfect passive forms. This is bhave prayoga, taken from rather unusual onomatopoeic verbs. Let's look at the translation. I think it's right below this. A lone bear was growling on and on, while dogs were barking all around it, the din filling the whole wilderness, where snakes were slithering through their anthill homes. So I don't know how many of you would even identify these verbs. I didn't. Jihikke, bubukke. But among other things, apart from this slight sense of weird collocation, you have the fact that these are in the perfect tense. And that's because the action was going on. It wasn't a perfective series of actions, but those dogs were barking, the bear was growling, the snakes were slithering. It's a continuing action in the past. This is non-perfective aspect. It has re-emerged in the Sanskrit of this Telangana poet. And if we had time, I would talk to you about the aorist long forms, because you could say that the aorist is Śākalyamalla's preferred mode for the narrative past. And he has some very remarkable aorist forms, and very often they have an aspect element involved. Very often we're talking about completed finite action. And there are also all kinds of Teluguisms. I guess we can leave that for the moment, but let me just say that if you see a text, if you read a text like Śākalyamalla, not all Southern Sanskrit texts are like this by any means, but we have hundreds which are like this, in which the proximity to the native mother tongue, the spoken language, is immediately transparent if you happen to know that vernacular language. And that means that this is a different kind of Sanskrit. Sometimes we talk about Sanskrit as the father language. We say that there's the mother language, which is going to be Tamil or Telugu or Malayalam or Kannada or whatever it might be. And there's a father language, Sanskrit, which is learned from the father or from an uncle or from a male teacher usually. And it comes with everything that we normally think about when we think about Sanskrit. It comes with a certain normativity and a kind of authority, for better or for worse. At the beginning of this talk, I said something which I hoped was going to undermine your belief in that truism, and I could say more about it. But the Sanskrit of a poet like Śākalyamalla, it's not a mother tongue. He didn't grow up speaking Sanskrit at home, but neither is it that kind of a father tongue. I think we might call it a stepmother tongue. It's a living language. It's a living language. And it has all the attributes of any of the living vernaculars that somebody like this particular poet would have known. It's a stepmother language. Okay, I'm going to say just a couple of words about Maṇipravāḷam and then we'll stop, okay? I had a feeling I wouldn't actually get to the Maṇipravāḷam section. So let me just say that we've been talking about Sanskrit in the vernacular, a kind of vernacular Sanskrit. There's also one particular kind of Sanskrit plus vernacular, which is called Maṇipravāḷam. It exists in different forms, but it is most well known from Kerala. And in fact, Kerala has a literature, a Maṇipravāḷam literature, which in my way of reading is actually a form of early Malayalam. But it has its own name, Maṇipravāḷam. And it even has a grammar. There's a book called the Leela Tilagam, which was written probably in the 14th or maybe 15th century. I think it might be a little later, which is a grammar of this kind of text. Maṇipravāḻam means rubies and coral. Rubies because money in this case does not mean sapphire, but it means rubies, as the author tells us. This grammar has all kinds of rules about what this Maṇipravāḻam is. We can't really go into it now. But one of the necessary, absolutely necessary features of it, according to this grammarian, is that it should include Sanskrit with Sanskrit conjugational and declensional endings, unlike what we saw earlier in the Srinatha verses. If you don't have that, it doesn't count as Maṇipravāḻam. And the other thing that is necessary I mean, it's not the only other thing, but one very prominent thing is that the Sanskrit and the Malayalam should blend in such a way that the whole thing sounds like Malayalam and feels like Malayalam, that there should be a harmony between the Sanskrit elements. Again, I want to say these are conjugated and declined forms, and the Malayalam elements. In that, it's perhaps a little different from some of the other things that we've seen in this lecture. So I'm going to end this talk just by reading two verses. They're here in the bottom of this page. They're Maṇipravāḷam. They come from a very beautiful 16th century text called the Chandrosavam. And they describe a pregnant Vaishya courtesan and how she spends her days and nights, mostly reading, because these Vaishyas were very cultivated. So here are two verses, and you can see what the curriculum of study for a Vaishya in the 16th century was felt to be in a Maṇipravāḷam text. We'll just read them, and we'll look at the English translation, and I'll stop, okay? Śākalyamalla tadanu Maṇipravāḷam-Malayalam Kadambaricharitam alputa bandha hridyam mattum Maranda mori vaigina kurudara sushrava bhava maduram Maṇipravāḷam. That's what she read. Let's look at the English. She was pregnant, right? She would spend her days, she, the noblewoman of honeyed words. That honeyed words in the Maṇipravāḷam is what would be called in Kannada an Adi-samasa, or in Telugu. That is, it includes a Malayalam component and a Sanskrit component. You're not supposed to do that in a compound. But in Maṇipravāḻam, it's possible. What did she read? She listened to, actually, that really means she read, I guess, or she heard somebody read out to her, the Śākuntala and the Malavikagnimitram of Kalidasa, and the marvelously constructed story of Kadambari. Towards evening, she heard works in Maṇipravāḻam, filled with feeling. A little bit like that very beautiful invocation verse that we heard at the beginning of this talk, which was in Nilambari. It should be a little in the direction of a lullaby. So I guess if you read Maṇipravāḻam, it's so sweet to the ear, so harmonious, and so filled with feeling that it's a good thing to read before going to bed. And by the way, if you look at the verse that we just went back, let's go back a second to it. You can just lift it just a second, yeah. So just look, I've highlighted the actual Dravidian Malayalam words, so to speak, in this verse. All the rest of it is Sanskrit, except for the fact that Adbhuta has become Albhuta in conformity with the Malayalam rules, okay? But everything else, beautiful Sanskrit. And there is a kind of beauty and gentle softness about this. Okay, let's go down and read the last verse. Okay, so here's the aesthetic goal or aim of this verse. Mandara kunda makaranda sitara vinda manda smitari padame chevil purunnu onnam narungu mabala parusha prayoge vata vadhuta navakunkuma vallariva. Once again, there's not a whole lot of Malayalam, Dravidian Malayalam here, but look what the poet says. Words like Mandara, Kunda, Makaranda, Sitaravinda, Mandasmita, these are Sanskrit words, of course. They were music to her ears. Chevil Purunnu. But she would shake like a kumkuma vine trembling in the wind if anyone spoke in harsh syllables. And by that, apparently, the author means harsh Sanskrit syllables. Because Maṇipravāḷam should not be harsh. It should be harmonious, honeyed, and sweet. That is not the case in other kinds of Maṇipravāḻam that we have. For example, there's a rare Tamil book. It's composed in the early 19th century in the northern part of the Tamil country. It's called Virata Parva Maṇipravāla Manjari. And it's in Maṇipravāḻam in a Tamil sense, very much like this Kerala Maṇipravāḻam, but there the author shows us from the very beginning that there should be some kind of disjunction or tension or dissonance between the Sanskrit parts and the Tamil parts of the text. I'm afraid I don't have time to go into this now. Let me just say that I hope this has been of some interest to you, and that I wish you many happy days of reading harmonious Maṇipravāḷam in one form or another, without too many harsh syllables. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, sir. That was indeed a very, very insightful and a fascinating lecture. Like, started off with answering, you went on to answer questions which you started off, why write in Sanskrit, what kind of Sanskrit, and also what is Sanskrit, what do you mean by Sanskrit, and a whole lot of texts you dealt in from the Sangam era till the contemporary times. It's absolutely amazing, and I think I was really looking forward to more on Maṇipravāḷam. Probably I think we would have one more lecture exclusively on Maṇipravāḷam. It is beautiful, sir. Thank you so much. I would now request Sangeeta ma'am to speak. And
Professor David Shulman for that absolutely brilliant lecture. And there are a lot of people who might like to say a word or share their thoughts. So I don't want to be between them and you. I think Dilip Menon was here too, but I think he has just left because there's something which he had to do immediately. But I also see Sudha Gopalakrishnan, and I know there are many other people. So what we were thinking is, if you would like to say something or share your thoughts briefly, of course, because maybe many may want to share, can you raise your hand? Which is, of course, this may be okay, but we may not see you. But there's a reactions icon there down below. And if you can raise your hand between me and Preet, we will call out your names and you can share your thought. And we can have a dialogue with David. So please raise your hand. I hope you saw that. It's in the reactions button on your screen. And you can raise your hand. Yes, there is one hand I already see.
do I unmute Aloka ma'am?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you can raise your hand, or also please let us know over chat if you have a question. Then I see Niranjan Uppur as a question. So may I first ask Professor Niranjan Uppur from IIT Tripura, Department of Linguistics, to share his question. Niranjan Uppur, I don't know whether we can see him, to unmute him. Yeah.
Yes. So, am I audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. It was a very insightful and wonderful talk. I really enjoyed. I am a linguist and I work on Dravidian languages. And you talked about this substratum influence. Substratum influence, the Sanskrit substratum influence. The traditional knowledge was that what Bhadraju Krishnamurti wrote and other Dravidian linguists wrote, they attributed the Sanskrit substratum to the Dravidian languages. And later, Professor Hans Henrik Hock majorly contested that. And he said it is not the Dravidian languages, but the Munda languages that give the substratum to the Sanskrit languages. I, as a linguist, I see that the debate is open. So I think we need more research, precisely because even today our knowledge of Munda languages is not very clear. We have Anderson's work, Anderson 2008 Munda languages, but we don't know much about Munda languages. This is
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree completely. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that is okay. That is okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely great. You know, it goes very, very far back, let alone the questions like syntax and modality and so on. It goes back as far as the phonology, because it's quite possible that what we regard today as a kind of universal feature in India, the retroflexion, it's quite possible that that comes out of the meeting of Munda, maybe also Dravidian and Indo-Aryan, I don't know. But it's also very likely to be the case that these features that I was talking about, which I know from the Dravidian languages, are also present in Munda. I've unfortunately never had the opportunity of learning a Munda language. I'd love to do it. But I agree that the issue is still very much open. And there's a very great likelihood that, in fact, this sort of universal set of features that we think of as, in South Asian languages, is present in Munda from the beginning. It's quite possible.
May I ask one more short question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is regarding Ashokan inscriptions. Now, in Ashokan inscriptions, we do not find use of Sanskrit, but use of Prakrit. Do you have any comments to offer on that?
Ashoka wrote he didn't write exactly, his chancellery produced these texts somehow in Prakrit, because I think he wanted it to communicate to people in something that was at least closer to their mother tongue. Prakrit, nobody should think that Prakrit, any of the Prakrits, are some kind of photographs of a spoken language. They were not. These are formalized literary dialects, but they're still closer to the spoken language than Sanskrit was. Also, I mean, it's more complex than that because it took some time before Sanskrit graduated into the position of being let's call it a political language. And it's actually, Prakrit seems to have preceded it in that. There's this wonderful new book by Andrew Alid, which I warmly recommend. And this also follows upon Shelley Pollock's work, which I'm sure you know, in which that moment of transition to Sanskrit is a kind of, he calls it a cosmopolitan language, and that means that it has a political and ideological charge to it. That's an important chapter, and he's quite right about that. So it actually, we're talking about the mid-3rd century BC. It's before that transition, right?
Possible. And this is again another my last.
If you could take a few more questions from other people.
No problem at all. No problem at all. No problem.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to you, Professor Niranjan.
Yes. Thank you very much.
We're hearing
Thank
some
you very
more
much,
voices. Yeah, thank you, Niranjan.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
I will probably take a question from Mr. Sunil Kumar. We see a question, sir. If you could keep your question a little brief. We're unmuting you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for the informative talk. I have read the book of yours on Tamil a few years back. So my question in short was, what do you believe, as in your opinion, what was the influence of Sanskrit further on, say, in Sri Lanka? Because Tamil kings had briefly conquered Lanka. And apart from that, we know that Buddhist and Pali traditions are very strong in Sri Lanka. So was there a juxtaposition or a commingling there?
So that's a question. Yeah, thank you. That's a question that's very close to my heart, my areas of interest these days. I'm hoping to write a book about Sri Lankan Tamil literature of the 17th and 18th centuries. I've been collecting these materials, and there's absolutely no question that the Tamil of these, the literary Tamil of these texts, it's an incredibly rich production, largely neglected or even forgotten today in Sri Lanka itself. There's no question that that kind of Tamil has its own particularity. There's, for example, a really amazing work. It's a Tamil version of the Raghuvansha by Anas Kesari. It's written in a Tamil idiom which I've never seen before. There's lots and lots of Sanskrit in it. I think there's also Sinhala influence, you could say, and not only in the purely linguistic sense. This is a long topic which I'd love to go into, but I don't think we'll have the time for it here. But the Tamil poets who were writing in Jaffna and Batikaloa in the 17th and 18th century, especially Jaffna, they were at least bilingual or maybe trilingual. That is, they knew Tamil, they knew Sanskrit, there's no question about that, and they also apparently knew and read Sinhala. And we see that penetration or interpenetration in, I would say, all of these literary texts. Whether Pali, which was of course the canonical language in Sri Lanka, whether Pali is also present in some specific way or not, I can't really say. I can sort of read Pali. My son reads and speaks Pali fluently, actually, but I can't really do it, and so I'm not in a position to say. But there's no doubt that we're talking about a multilingual, a polyglossic, and also what Pollock has rightly called hyperglossic environment. It's also true throughout South India. You don't have to go as far as Sri Lanka to find this polyglossic and hyperglossic cultural environment.
Yeah, ma'am.
Yes, I think next is
Ushma, ma'am, I'm sorry. Yeah, your voice is not audible. Yeah, Ushma ji, we are unmuting you.
Professor Shulman, that was a wonderful lecture. I learned so much that I had no idea that there was so much of a Sanskrit influence in the southern languages. So it actually sounds that there's more Sanskrit words, classical words in the southern languages, and we in the north, we've got a lot more of the Persian, the Arabic, and Turkish words that have infiltrated into our languages.
Right.
Is that a correct assessment?
So it's a little more complex than that, but it's true. And basically what you said is exactly right. That is, I began with Persian. Persian was my first love. If you know Persian, then actually much of modern Hindi is intelligible without too much extra effort, because there's so much Persian. That also includes the Arabic words in Persian that has gone into Hindi, actually all of the North Indian languages. Also, there's quite a lot of Persian, for that matter, in the southern languages too, once you begin to sensitize yourself to it. But, Hindi, I don't know if we should talk about Hindi or Hindustani. Urdu, there's no question that the, let's call it the lexical enrichment, comes mostly out of Persian and Arabic. Hindi, the conventional wisdom is that the lexical enrichment and amplification comes from Sanskrit in some form or another. I suppose that's true. If you think about Hindustani, however, there's a rather significant number of Tadbhava Sanskrit words. That is to say, Sanskrit that has come in through Prakrit, or one of the Prakrits, and then later through various Middle Indic channels of transmission. So I wouldn't by any means make light of that. But it is true, I think, that people who know one of the southern languages, and if you happen to know Sanskrit, you're immediately aware, whichever language it is, including Tamil, that Sanskrit has a very, very pronounced presence there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Amba Kulkarni, is she still around? We saw her hand raised. Professor Amba Kulkarni, is she still there? I don't know whether she was raising her hand for a while. Okay, it looks okay. Yeah, she's not there, I think. Okay, so then let's go to the next, please.
Yes, I would request Aloka ji, ma'am. I saw your hands up. Yeah, we are unmuting you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
It will be really nice if you could also please self-introduce yourself so that we all know.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm a historian. I live in Telangana, and David and myself have studied together. And we sort of converged in some way on Telangana. I wanted to really, as usual, a fantastic lecture, David. And I'm really interested in the way in which you problematized how Telugu, the early Telugu, interacted with Sanskrit. And somebody had said this before me, that there is this particularity in the way in which the different Dravidian languages have adopted or absorbed Sanskrit. So in Telangana, I think you brought in this whole question about how they were transforming it. They were transforming Sanskrit, right? I mean, it was like, it's like in a sense, they're playing with Sanskrit and making it Sanskrit again, right? Now, I wanted to bring in the social context because, Telangana as a region is a confluence of, you mentioned to the first answer, you mentioned, no, that the Munda influences the, other Austric languages, and then, it's right in the middle. It's where cultures meet, so to speak. I was wondering whether, because, the other examples from the far south are totally, I mean, there's a very different interaction with Sanskrit, I would say. There's already a literature. You started with the Sangam, but there is in Telangana and particularly in the Deccan as a whole, we don't have a substratum of Dravidian literature. We do have the Pali tradition and all. So I was wondering whether it had got something to do with this interactive space that Telangana was.
Of course it does. I mean, it's a very nice question. Thank you for that. And I agree completely that there's a playful aspect to this. That's exactly right. We didn't have too much time to talk about it, but were we to spend a little more time on almost any of these texts that I brought, you would see that there's this aspect of playing with the Sanskrit, re-Sanskritizing it, juxtaposing the Sanskrit and the other languages and so on. It's also exactly true what you have said, that in Telangana, that is in all of Andhra really, there's a very strong element of Prakrit speech. And actually Prakrit came, I think, before Sanskrit, or at least together with Sanskrit. Again, if you read Andrew Allitt's wonderful book, you'll see he says correctly that there is no Sanskrit without Prakrit and no Prakrit without Sanskrit. They're a pair, and that was obviously true in the case of Telangana. Look at the early dynasties, the Satavahana, the Ikshvaku inscriptions and so on. It's a kind of Prakrit-Sanskrit combination. That's one way of saying it. There's a more nuanced way of saying it. So that's quite right. Not only that, the tradition, the long tradition of Prakrit scholarship, continuous tradition of tremendous, deep, penetrating scholarship about the Prakrit languages, also Pali for that matter, in all of Andhra, also in Telangana, especially in Rayalaseema actually, but not only in Rayalaseema, also in Andhra. That's one of the diagnostic features of the Andhra cultural area, generally speaking. And it's much, much attenuated further south in the Tamil case, no question about it. And of course, you're right that there's a social configuration shifting, many developing, evolving social configurations, which are very much a part of this. I would just say one last thing along those lines, though. First of all, every single work has its context. It came out of it was written by somebody who belonged to a group of people and lived in a particular geographical and cultural environment, no doubt about that. The one thing I want to kind of warn against is one should not assume that Sanskrit is identified with, let's call them the Brahmin castes, because Sanskrit had a much, much wider cachet. And certainly by the time we reach, the early modern or late medieval texts, the Nayaka period or whatever, we see people writing Sanskrit and they come from everywhere. They come from the margins of society. They come from what would perhaps have been considered the very lower, parts of the society. There are also Brahmins there, of course. Sanskrit was a part of the universal discourse. Anybody who was educated enough to compose poetry at all would be expected to know Sanskrit.
Actually, the first written evidence, apart from the Shatavahana inscriptions, are those wonderful coins you have from Karimnagar and Kotalingala, which Arudra says is the beginning of the Telugu language.
That is right. They are the beginning of the Telugu language. That's right. And Telugu, Telugu existed in some form, which we see mostly in the inscriptions, to some extent in the numismatics, for about 500 years before Nannaya. That is before Nannaya turned it into a literary language. So,
Exactly. Thank you
that's
so much. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you,
so
Alok.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Alokaji. Listen to your conversation. We have a few more people and we would like to have their voice too heard. So we are requesting David to spare a few more moments. These are very interesting people. And we are just going by the order of who raised their hand first. So pardon us for that, following that. So we will be calling out Shankar Raja.
Can I just interrupt for a second? I'll have to go in about 10 minutes or so.
Sure, we will wind up in 10 minutes.
Okay.
So what we will do is we will have the questions raised by all of them, and David can take up the questions now or he can respond later. I think that will be a good idea. So the order of names I think we will request is Shankar Rajaraman, Mr. Kannan, Professor G.C. Tripathi, and Sudha Gopalakrishnan in that order. And Preet, you may please say that this list is
Shankar sir,
followed.
over to you. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And may I request all of you, please keep this 10 minutes in mind. Please, very brief introduction of yourself and very brief question or your thoughts.
Thank you. I'm Shankar Rajaraman. I'm a postdoc fellow at NIAS. Thanks a lot for the lecture, Professor. I was wondering how poets like Srinatha or say Nagavarma of the Karnataka Kadambari fame manage shleshas, especially the Sabhanga type of shleshas in phrases such as Cheto Nalam Kamayate Madiyam. How do they actually translate such phrases without compromising on the shlesha?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. I saw it in the chat. It's a lovely question. There's not a single answer to that. That is, it always depends on the particular verse and the moment and so on. So, I mean, there are many possible directions. One possible direction, as you could imagine, is that they will simply take the Sanskrit phrase as it is and stick it in the Telugu and allow the Sabhanga Shlesha to, live its life in Telugu just as it lived its life in Sanskrit. But there are other ways to do it. You can unpack the Shlesha. You can unpack it in such a way that you'll get both registers in different parts of the verse. Another way, we see it in the Kalaponoremu, for example, where there's a very important Shlesha section. It's a kind of riddle verse, which is also an Anuloma Pratiloma verse. You can read it from left to right and from right to left, and it's very Shlishta. So there, you can reproduce in Telugu something that was initially a Shlishta verse in Sanskrit. In other words, you can produce the same kind of Sabhanga Shlesha, if you don't want to do it like that, in Telugu as you do in Sanskrit. It's a way of translating, you could say, or reproducing, or re-Sanskritizing the text. But it depends very much on the individual instance, However, I do want to say, and I thank you for your question, the Telugu poets were absolutely capable of confronting this challenge and coming up with highly original solutions to it. No question about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. What we will do is we will take up the next two questions together and then also request Sudhaji. She may not have a question, but she may like to say something. We are requesting her. And then perhaps David could respond because I keep that time which you told me in mind. So first, the two questions from Kannan Ramachandran and Professor G.C. Tripathi in that order.
Good evening, Professor. I'm Kannan Ramachandran. I was born and bred in Kerala. I grew up in Kerala, then moved to other parts. Right now, I'm in Tamil Naiṭatam. I have a fairly good exposure to the literature of the Tamil and Malayalam. Though Malayalam is my first love, Tamil is my mother tongue. My question is, I have a little exposure to Maṇipravāḷam. I asked a question in the last session also. Most of the content or the bhava of the Maṇipravāḷam literature that I have learned while in school was always the bhava of Sringaram or Lasya or Nayaka Nayaki bhava. Yeah. And today I had an exposure when you gave examples of the Telugu. There also, this is amplified, the Nayaka Nayaki bhava. Yeah. And if you take the examples of Padam, the first Padam that we heard today, yes. We have in Kathakali, Mohiniyattam, all those things have adapted. Is it like the Maṇipravāḷam always amplifies the Srinkara or Lasya bhava, or you have other bhavas also? Like even in Iranian and Thambi, other this thing, or the Mayura Sandesham of Malayalam, all of them yes. are amplifying that bhava.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. Kannan. We have only a few minutes and we wouldn't want David to leave us, so let's just finish the questions.
Yes.
Professor G.C. Tripathi, please. Can someone unmute?
I've unmuted, sir. I've asked for requested for an unmute. Yeah.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I don't see Professor Shulman here.
He
I
is
can
there.
see you, Professor Tripathi. Very nice to see
Hello,
you.
Mr. Shulman. I'm
Hello.
very happy to see you on the screen today. I remember that we met in 2001 in Berlin in a student colleague with Professor Hermann Kulke and Skt
Yes.
and Sanjay was also there.
Right.
And I greatly appreciate your work on the history of Orissa, as well as mainly on Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. So I have only a very small suggestion to make. You have given, it was a very, anyway, first of all, it was a very illuminating lecture, and it answered a number of questions that I also had in my mind. My suggestion is that you have given most of the quotations and illustrations from only Kavya, exclusively Kavya literature of Sanskrit and Telugu and Tamil, etc. Right. But there are many Maṇipravāḷam works in prose as well, composed by mainly philosophers, great philosophers of Tamil Nadu. So especially, your lecture, it gives the impression that Maṇipravāḷam style is prevalent or is available only in Kavya literature and not in prose literature. But there are many, many prose works, especially the works on Indian philosophy, Vedanta, etc. Vedanta and Ramanuja Vedanta, especially. Yeah. So kindly in your next lecture, if you give on this topic, give also a few illustrations from the prose literature of Maṇipravāḷam style as well.
Thank you, Professor Tripathi. Thank you very much. I remember that Niranjan wanted some question to be asked. If it is very, very brief, you can just say it perhaps in a few seconds, and then I'm going to request Sudhaji to share her thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I'll take only 1 minute. It is just a
no less than comment. 1 minute, sir. We may not have that much time. Sorry.
Choice of Sanskrit words may depend on the prosody also, chandas. So that is one observation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Niranjan. And I think now I will request Dr. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, the director of Sahapedia, an online portal which we are all in love with, and she's also an adjunct professor of NIAS and a good friend of mine, and we share the same state and same interests as well. Sudhaji, your thoughts and comments, and your good friend has just given a wonderful lecture.
I was not going to actually talk at all. Anyway, David has given a fantastic lecture as always, but I don't think I want to ask a question at all. But perhaps, like Professor Tripathi was saying in another lecture, perhaps he could, highlight the special aspects of Maṇipravāḷam, concentrate on that, and then perhaps elaborate. And there may be many, many questions with that. Actually, the thing is, there is so much less of time for interaction. That happens all the time with such a brilliant talk, and everybody wants to ask. So I don't think I have a specific question this time. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Sangeeta, do you want me to, thanks a lot, Sudha. Sangeeta, do you want me to answer the two?
Yeah, I was about to, I was about to tell you, David, I completely leave it to you because I don't know how many minutes you have left.
I don't have many, but
we may need just 2 minutes at the end to thank you. Otherwise, all the time is yours.
Well, just very briefly, so Kandan's question about the Sringara and Lasya Bhava, I think it's true that a lot of the Kerala Maṇipravāḷam texts do privilege the let's call it the erotic arena or something like that. I don't think it's uniquely like that. It's not only that. We can find all other kinds of things. And incidentally, I'm not very happy with the conventional standard categories like Sringara and Vira and all of the usual things, because I think they have a slightly artificial and brittle quality. And actually, if we look at the literatures, any of the literatures, we'll see that they're probably better, more penetrating and deeper ways of making these characterizations. But it's true that a lot of the Maṇipravāḷam literature in Malayalam, in Kerala, is about Sringara. On the other hand, this touches upon Professor Tripathi's question. We know of other texts. There was a medical text Ayurveda text, Alatur, which is in Maṇipravāḷam, according to the Lila Tilakam. And once we move out of the Kerala area and start looking at Maṇipravāḷam, something that calls itself Maṇipravāḻam in other areas, so we have Tamil Sri Vaishnava Maṇipravāḻam. However, it does not fit the grammatical definition that the Lila Tilakam gives, for the most part. It has very little presence of Sanskrit vibhaktis or conjugational endings. Suganya Anandakrishnan is here. She knows this better than I do, and I think she's actually just recently published on the web something about that. So Sri Vaishnava Maṇipravāḻam commentaries, they actually think of it as Maṇipravāḻam today. There's an excellent book about it by Venkatachari. It's prose, but it does not fit the kind of Maṇipravāḻam that was grammaticalized by the Lila Tilakam. It's something quite different. It deserves a more penetrating definition on its own. But of course, it's certainly true that we do have, first of all, we have Gadya within Maṇipravāḻam, no question about that. And there are texts, maybe Shastra-like texts, in some kind of Maṇipravāḻam. That is also there. Thank you for these questions. It was very lovely to have a response. And thank you, Sudha, for your kind words.
Thank you so much, sir. I think it is indeed, like Professor Tripathi rightly said, it was an illuminating lecture. And we are really honored to have you with us and speak on the traditions of Sanskrit and interesting topic on the vernaculars of Sanskrit. And it's really interesting to see how vernaculars are seen in Sanskrit and vice versa. And as I think a lot of us have requested, we probably think on it and arrange for a separate lecture on Maṇipravāḻam. Thank you so much, sir. And I would now request Niharika Sharma to inform us about our upcoming lecture, followed by a formal vote of thanks by Amrita. Over to you.
Thank you, Preet. Thank you, sir, for the wonderful lecture. The upcoming lecture is on the topic Hinduism and the history of Dharma Shastra. This lecture will be delivered by Professor Patrick Olivelle on 3rd March 2021 at 7 p.m. IST, and the Austin time is 2nd March 7:30 a.m. CTT. Thank you, Preet.
Amrita.
It was an absolute pleasure listening to you, sir. We really enjoyed your lecture today. And also, thank you so much for all the recitings that you had from classical poetry. We really enjoyed it. On behalf of NIAS and Consciousness Studies program, I thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge with us. We are extremely grateful for you, sir. And also, I would like to thank Professor Sangeeta ma'am, Dean and Head of NIAS CSP, for conceptualizing and facilitating this Sanskrit lecture series and giving us this wonderful opportunity to listen to so many great scholars. I'm also thankful to our director, Dr. Sailesh Nayak and NIAS, for providing us this wonderful opportunity for this platform for organizing this lecture. We are also grateful to Preet for hosting today's session, and also thanks to the entire team, NIAS CSP, Meera, Niharika, Pushya, Abhishek, and Ashwini for all the support. And also, I would like to thank all the audience for your interactions and questions today. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining with us. See you all for your next session. Thank you so much.
Ma'am wants to just say a line. Ma'am, over to you.
No, well, I just wanted to say who is this young scholar who just thanked you, David, because they also need to know. They also need to be known. So this is Amrita MK. She's a young scholar working on Indian aesthetics and particularly Dhvani theory in the context of Theyyam and similar arts from Kerala. So she's right now in Calicut, the center of all these performances.
Yeah. I'd love to meet Amrita someday.
Yes, so we once again thank Professor David Shulman for the wonderful evening and Preet Kona for coordinating all this and being the Sutradhara as usual. And we thank all of you there who have been with us for this wonderful lecture. It's truly unforgettable experience for all of us. And we definitely are going to request David Shulman to give the next lecture and the topic you have decided.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Namaskaram.
Thank you.
Bye. Good evening.